It was a calm afternoon at one of the city's most elegant cafes, the kind of place where the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the soft hum of classical music drifting through the air. The polished wood floors and warm lighting gave the cafe a cozy yet upscale atmosphere, attracting a steady stream of customers. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect drama to unfold, but that's exactly what happened one fateful afternoon. Behind the counter, a young woman moved gracefully between tables, balancing her tray of drinks with ease. She was used to the cafe's usual crowd, business people on their lunch breaks, couples enjoying a quiet coffee date, and the occasional musician who came to play the grand piano tucked in the corner. But today she noticed something different. At a corner table, a group of men were sitting together. Their conversation was loud, filled with laughter and booming voices, but it wasn't the kind of conversation you'd expect from a group of close friends. It sounded more like the typical chatter of businessmen, trying to one-up each other and show off their achievements. One man in particular caught her attention. He sat confidently at the head of the table, dressed in a suit so expensive that it seemed to shimmer in the light. His name wasn't important. He was the kind of man who made a statement just by being in the room. He was tall, with a slightly graying beard and glasses that added to his air of superiority. His name could have been anything, really, because his presence spoke volumes. As the waitress moved around the cafe, she overheard pieces of his conversation. He was boasting about his latest business deal, talking about how he'd recently purchased a luxury car and another mansion for his growing collection. His voice carried over the soft piano music playing in the background, and from his tone it was clear that he was used to people listening. He enjoyed being the center of attention, relishing in the fact that others admired his success. After a while, the topic shifted and the conversation turned toward music. The man, still clearly reveling in the spotlight, mentioned that he was also quite the accomplished musician. He laughed almost condescendingly as he told his companions how easily he could play any instrument, especially the piano. He was so sure of his abilities that he seemed to be daring someone to challenge him. "Do you see that piano?" he said, gesturing toward the grand piano in the corner of the room. "I bet I could sit down right now and play something that would blow your minds. In fact, I'm pretty sure no one in this room could even come close to what I can do." The others at the table chuckled nervously, clearly unsure of how to respond. A few of them gave half-hearted compliments, but most were too busy scrolling through their phones to engage in the conversation. The man clearly didn't mind, though. He was used to being the one who dominated every room he entered, and today was no different. But then something unexpected happened. As the man continued to talk, a soft voice interrupted his boasting. It was the waitress, the one who had been quietly moving between tables, doing her job without drawing attention to herself. She wasn't looking for a spotlight, and she certainly wasn't the type to engage in the kinds of discussions that filled the cafe every day. But today she felt something stir inside her, a desire to speak up, to show this man that talent wasn't defined by the price of your suit or the number of zeros on your paycheck. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice calm but steady, "but if you're so confident, why don't you show us?" The words hung in the air for a moment. The man turned his head, momentarily surprised that anyone, especially someone who worked here, would dare to speak to him like that. His face, still carrying the smugness of someone who is used to getting their way, shifted slightly. The other people at the table looked at him expectantly, though it wasn't clear whether they were waiting for him to respond or whether they just wanted to see what would happen next. For a second, there was silence. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall and the quiet music in the background. The waitress, whose name no one at the table knew, stood by the piano, her hands folded politely in front of her. Her gaze was steady, almost challenging. She wasn't looking for a fight. She just wanted to see if this man was as good as he claimed. The businessman, still taken aback by the challenge, let out a short laugh. "You want me to play the piano?" he asked, as if the idea was laughable. "Well, I guess I could show you all a thing or two. I wouldn't want to disappoint, but I hope you don't mind if I make it look easy." He stood up from the table and made his way over to the piano, his steps full of the kind of swagger that only comes with someone who has been pampered by success. He sat down at the bench, adjusting his suit as if preparing for an important performance. The others at the table stopped their conversations, curious to see what would unfold. Most of them seemed to expect him to play something impressive, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Perhaps for the first time, the man wasn't entirely sure he could live up to the image he had created of himself. He placed his fingers on the keys and began to play. The music he produced was, well, underwhelming. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't good either. He played a simple, basic melody, one that anyone with a little practice could perform. There was no depth, no passion, no real skill behind his playing. His fingers moved stiffly, and the notes rang out with a certain mechanical quality, as if he were trying too hard to impress the audience. But it was clear to everyone in the room that he was struggling. The waitress, who had been watching quietly from the side, couldn't help but notice how forced his performance was. She had seen enough musicians come and go in this cafe to recognize when someone was truly talented, and when they were just pretending. And this man was pretending. As he finished his short, uninspired piece, he looked around the room waiting for applause. There was a brief silence before a few scattered claps came from the table, but they weren't genuine, more like polite gestures than any real appreciation of the music. The businessman smiled smugly, thinking he had earned their admiration, but the waitress could see the truth behind his performance. She had been watching him closely, and now she knew exactly what needed to happen. This wasn't about showing off, it was about proving a point. Talent didn't come with a price tag. It wasn't something you could buy. It was something you worked for, something you bled for, and the people who truly had it didn't need to brag or boast. They just showed up and did the work. With that thought in her mind, the waitress walked over to the piano, her heart beating a little faster than usual. She wasn't one to step into the spotlight, but something about the man's arrogance made her want to show him what real talent looked like. She didn't need to announce it. She didn't need to draw attention to herself. She simply sat down at the piano and placed her hands on the keys. For a moment, the cafe seemed to hold its breath. The businessman, still standing by the piano, glanced over at her, a look of disbelief crossing his face. He couldn't have known what was coming. But Eliza, the waitress, wasn't trying to impress anyone. She simply wanted to show him what real music could do. Her fingers brushed the keys, and the room seemed to shift. The notes she played were smooth and flowing, effortlessly weaving a melody that was at once graceful and powerful. She played with emotion, each note a reflection of her passion for the piano, and the audience could feel it. This wasn't just someone playing the piano. This was someone speaking through the music, telling a story without words. As she played, the cafe slowly fell silent. The conversations died down, and the eyes of every single person in the room were fixed on her. Even the businessman, who had once been so full of himself, found himself frozen, watching her hands move across the keys as if they were telling a story he'd never heard before. And for the first time in a long time, he was captivated. It wasn't just about the notes. It was about the way the music filled the room, the way it resonated with everyone who heard it. And in that moment, the rich man realized something he hadn't expected to learn today. True talent had nothing to do with wealth or status. It had everything to do with heart. And this young woman, the waitress who had simply wanted to do her job and go home, had just taught him a lesson he would never forget. The rich man sat there, his fingers still lingering on the piano keys as if waiting for the applause he thought was inevitable. He had just played, and in his mind it had been an impressive display of musical prowess. Sure, it wasn't Beethoven or Chopin, but he was certain it was enough to earn a few respectful nods. After all, he was a successful businessman. Didn't his accomplishments in the boardroom make him an expert in every other field? But as the seconds ticked by, and the sound of his last note faded into the background, he began to notice the silence around him. It wasn't the silence of admiration. It was the kind of silence that you feel when you know something isn't quite right. The cafe, once filled with the low murmur of conversation, was now eerily quiet. It wasn't because the customers were in awe of his playing. No, it was because they were all watching someone else. They were watching the waitress, the young woman who had only moments ago challenged him without hesitation. She was standing there now, just a few feet away from the piano. And instead of retreating into the shadows like so many others would have, she walked forward. There was no rush. There was no drama. She wasn't making a big scene or drawing unnecessary attention to herself. She simply moved with purpose, as though she knew exactly what was about to happen. As she approached the piano, the businessman couldn't help but feel a twinge of annoyance. Who was she to think she could step into his world? She was just a waitress, after all. He had already given his performance. He was the one people should be applauding. But then, as she sat down at the piano, something shifted. It wasn't the same as when he had taken his seat. Her movements were quiet but confident. She didn't pause to adjust her clothing or glance at the crowd. She just placed her hands on the keys and took a breath. The cafe patrons, who had been waiting to see the businessman's grand display of skill, fell into an uncomfortable silence. The waitress, her presence now felt more like a force, gently pressed her fingers onto the piano keys. And from the very first note, the entire room seemed to breathe in sync with her. The businessman shifted uncomfortably. He was still standing there by the piano watching, though it seemed as if his earlier sense of superiority had started to crack. He had expected to be the one drawing the attention. He had expected everyone to be wowed by his performance, to see him as the most talented person in the room. But now it was clear that all eyes were on her, and then she began to play. At first it was soft. A single delicate melody that felt like a whisper carried through the room. The rich man's eyes widened as he heard the subtle beauty of her music. It wasn't like anything he had expected. He had been prepared for her to stumble, to make an embarrassing mistake. But there was no mistake. There was only the slow, rising crescendo of something far deeper and more meaningful than he could have ever imagined. The music she played wasn't the simple melody he had performed. It wasn't a piece you could just learn to play in a few hours or with a few months of practice. This was something different. It was a piece that resonated with emotion, something beyond the skill of the fingers on the keys. It was as if each note she struck carried a story, and those stories were all being told in real time. Her fingers moved effortlessly, like they knew exactly where to go next. The richness of her playing was in the way she controlled the tempo, the way she made the piano speak in ways that words never could. The music filled the cafe like a soft breeze, sweeping over the tables and lifting the spirits of those who listened. The sound of the piano was full of grace, power, and depth, everything the businessman's performance had lacked. As the music swelled, something strange happened to the rich man. He couldn't look away. He had expected to be impressed by his own performance, but now he was the one who was in awe. He had thought his basic melody would suffice, but now, in the presence of this unexpected virtuosity, his own playing seemed like nothing more than a rough sketch in comparison. There was no showmanship here. There were no flashy moves or over-the-top flourishes. It was just pure, honest music, and that was the moment the businessman began to realize how out of his depth he was. The more he listened, the more he understood that this woman wasn't just playing to prove a point. She wasn't trying to show off or challenge him. She was simply doing what she loved, and that, in itself, was powerful. The cafe, once filled with the quiet chatter of people enjoying their coffee, had now fallen into complete stillness. All eyes were on her, and the atmosphere had changed entirely. There was something deeply magnetic about the way she played. It wasn't just the technical skill, it was the soul behind it. The passion, the love. It was something that the businessman, for all his wealth and accolades, couldn't buy. The more the rich man listened, the more he could feel the tension in his chest. It wasn't just about his own playing anymore. He realized, with growing discomfort, that he had been so focused on trying to impress others, on showing off his skills, that he had missed something essential about music. Something that had been standing right in front of him this entire time. As the music continued, his earlier arrogance began to dissolve. His stiff posture softened, his confident smile fading into a look of quiet admiration. The once proud businessman now stood there, transfixed as the woman continued to play. He couldn't help but feel a sense of humility creeping over him, and for the first time in a long while, he questioned everything he thought he knew about talent and success. He had always assumed that talent was something you could acquire, something you could claim if you had the resources, the connections, the money. He had assumed that being successful in business meant he could master anything else too. But now, watching this waitress play, he realized that talent wasn't something you could buy or manufacture. It was something you had to nurture. It was something that came from a deep, unspoken place within. And that's where he had been missing the mark. She wasn't playing for anyone in particular. She wasn't playing for approval, not for a reward, not for praise. She was playing because it was in her. The music flowed from her naturally, effortlessly, like it was a part of who she was. It was a reminder that some things in life can't be faked, no matter how many suits you own or how many cars you drive. Real talent, the kind that made people stop and listen, came from the heart. The rich man shifted his weight from one foot to the other, feeling an unfamiliar discomfort. He had always prided himself on his accomplishments, but today, standing in the midst of this quiet cafe with nothing but the sound of the piano filling the space around him, he realized just how hollow that pride had been. He had spent so much of his life trying to prove himself to the world. He had surrounded himself with wealth, with power, with people who admired him, but in all that he had forgotten the simple, pure joy that came from doing something you loved simply for the sake of doing it. As the last note of the piece rang out, the room remained quiet for just a beat longer. It was as if everyone was holding their breath, reluctant to let the moment end. And when the sound finally faded, there was a soft, almost reverential silence. The businessman, though still standing by the piano, slowly began to clap. At first it was just a soft clap, almost tentative, as if he wasn't sure whether or not he had the right to applaud. But then, as the applause around him grew louder, he joined in, his hands coming together in recognition of something he couldn't quite put into words. His claps were slow, deliberate, and filled with a sense of respect. He didn't have to say anything. His applause spoke volumes. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like the most important person in the room. The waitress stood up from the piano, her hands resting gently by her sides. She didn't seek the applause, nor did she wait for any further recognition. Her purpose had never been to show him up. It was simply to remind everyone that talent, true talent, always shines through, no matter who you are or where you come from. As she walked back to her duties, she didn't look for praise or admiration. It wasn't necessary. In her quiet confidence, she had already won something far more valuable, something no amount of wealth could buy. The rich man sat down at his table, still trying to process what had just happened. His fingers absent-mindedly tapped the edge of the table, and he stared at the waitress as she moved between tables, taking orders and serving drinks. It was almost surreal to think that the same young woman who had just stunned everyone with her piano playing had been serving coffee and pastries just moments before. He glanced around the cafe and noticed something else. The customers who had been chatting and scrolling on their phones were now watching her too. A few were whispering to each other, nodding, even exchanging smiles. They were amazed not just by her talent, but by the way she carried herself. She wasn't flashy. She didn't demand attention. She simply did what she loved, and everyone noticed. The businessman who had spent so much of his life trying to prove himself suddenly felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in years: humility. He realized that his life had been full of competitions he didn't even enjoy, chasing recognition that didn't matter, and collecting achievements that didn't give him joy. And here was this waitress, living fully in the moment, expressing herself through something she loved, completely unapologetic and unbothered by status or wealth. He leaned back in his chair, recalling the moments of his performance, how mechanical and shallow it had felt in comparison to hers. He had been so sure of himself, so convinced that skill could be faked, but he couldn't deny what he had just heard. Her music had depth. It had feeling. It had honesty. And suddenly he understood something important. Talent wasn't about pride or ego. It was about heart. Meanwhile, the waitress returned to her station, carrying drinks for a nearby table. She smiled politely at the customers, still humble and calm, even though she had completely captivated the room just moments ago. She didn't linger on her performance, didn't look around to see who was impressed. For her, the piano was a part of her life, a way to express herself, not a way to prove anything. The businessman watched her for a long moment, then slowly reached for his coffee, realizing he had been holding it too long. The warmth of the cup grounded him as he reflected on the lesson he hadn't expected to learn that afternoon. He thought about his life outside the cafe, about the constant pressure to impress, to outdo, to win. And suddenly it all seemed hollow, compared to the joy of creating something beautiful simply because it matters to you. His accomplishments felt small. Curiosity got the better of him, and he spoke, not wanting to seem rude, but genuinely interested. "Do you play often?" he asked quietly, almost afraid of disturbing the calmness she radiated. The waitress looked up, slightly surprised, and smiled. "Whenever I get the chance," she said simply. Her tone was gentle but confident. It wasn't boastful. There was no hint of arrogance, just honesty. He nodded slowly. "You're really talented. I didn't expect—" His words trailed off. He couldn't finish the sentence because he realized he didn't even know how to describe what he had just heard. It wasn't just talent, it was something deeper. Something that went beyond technical skill or practice. She smiled faintly and returned to her work, carrying herself with quiet dignity. There was no need for validation, no need for praise. She didn't perform for recognition. She performed because it was part of her, and that was enough. The businessman took a sip of his coffee, letting her words, and the lesson they carried, sink in. For the first time, he felt a twinge of inspiration, a sense that maybe he could change something about the way he approached life. It wasn't about winning, showing off, or being the best in everyone else's eyes. It was about finding what mattered to you, nurturing it, and letting it flourish. As he sat there quietly, he began to notice little things he hadn't before. The way she greeted regular customers with warmth, the patience she showed to a child struggling with a pastry, the genuine care in her voice as she took an elderly man's order. Her presence didn't dominate the room. It improved the atmosphere. People felt lighter, happier, more at ease, and it was all natural, effortless. He found himself thinking about the piano again. The music she had played was lingering in his mind, weaving between the thoughts he had carried into the cafe that day. It wasn't just notes, it was a feeling, something that had entered his chest and refused to leave, and he knew that he would carry that feeling with him long after he left this place. Around him, the cafe returned to its usual rhythm. Customers laughed softly. The coffee machines hissed and soft music played in the background. But for him, nothing felt normal anymore. Everything had shifted. He had been reminded of something simple but profound. True skill, true artistry, and true joy don't need validation. They don't require applause, status, or wealth. They simply exist, and when someone encounters them, it changes the way they see the world. He realized he had been humbled in the most unexpected way, not by a competitor or a critic, but by someone living a life far removed from his own, someone who had embraced her gift quietly, humbly, and beautifully. And in that realization, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: gratitude. Gratitude for the reminder that life wasn't only about what you could acquire, but about what you could create and share with others. The waitress moved back to the piano at a quieter moment, her hands brushing the keys once more. It wasn't a performance. It was simply a moment of peace. The businessman watched silently, understanding now that this was what it meant to connect with music, with life, and with oneself. He had been seeking validation in the wrong places. That afternoon, a lesson had been taught without words. A challenge had been issued and answered, but not in the way he had expected. And while the rich man had come to the cafe expecting to impress, he left changed. Not because of his own actions, but because of hers. The music she played had opened a door in his mind and his heart, showing him that talent, passion, and humility could carry a power far beyond money or status. For the rest of the day, the rich man couldn't stop thinking about the piano and the waitress who had played it. He replayed the melody in his mind over and over, and felt a quiet resolve growing within him. Perhaps it was time to stop trying to prove himself constantly, to stop letting ego drive every action. Perhaps it was time to find something that truly mattered to him, to nurture it, and to approach life with a little more humility. And in that simple cafe, amid the scent of coffee and soft laughter of patrons, a silent transformation had begun. A transformation that would change the way he looked at himself, at others, and at the small, beautiful moments that life often hides in plain sight. The next few days felt different for the businessman. Everything seemed quieter, more meaningful in a way he couldn't quite explain. He was still carrying the memory of the waitress's music, like a soft echo in his mind that wouldn't fade. Even as he sat in his sleek office, surrounded by glossy reports and spreadsheets, something had shifted. The pursuit of wealth, success, and external validation didn't seem as important anymore. He found himself thinking about the moments after he had left the cafe. He had walked out of that place feeling like a different person, though he couldn't immediately put his finger on why. The clink of coffee cups, the low murmur of conversation, and the soft melody from the piano all lingered in his thoughts. It was as though the world outside had grown sharper, more vivid, while the constant hum of his business life seemed suddenly hollow. The real change came when he realized how empty the noise of his life had been. Meetings, business deals, flashy parties, everything that used to drive him had started to feel like a performance. He was living in a world of appearances, where success was measured by the size of a bank account or the number of luxury cars parked outside a mansion. But in that cafe, a simple waitress had shown him something far more valuable. A life lived for the joy of creating, for the love of music, for something real. It wasn't about impressing others anymore. It wasn't about being the best at everything. It was about being authentic, about finding something that mattered to him deeply and dedicating himself to it, just for the sake of it, not for any external reward. The businessman began to look at his company in a new light. The relentless competition and drive for profit seemed smaller now, less important. He had spent years building his empire, sure, but what had he truly built within himself? Was he just a collection of titles, awards, and assets? Or was there something more? One evening, after a long day of meetings, he found himself once again drawn to the cafe. It was a quiet place, away from the noise of the city, a world apart from the rush and stress of his usual routine. His footsteps echoed softly on the sidewalk as he made his way down the street, still unsure of what he was looking for, but knowing he needed to return to that space of calm. When he entered the cafe, the same familiar warmth washed over him. The smell of freshly ground coffee beans, the soft murmur of conversations, and in the distance the grand piano in the corner. The same peaceful atmosphere he had experienced before seemed to pull him in like a magnet. He took a seat at the same corner table where he had sat just a few days ago. The waitress was there again, moving between tables with the same quiet grace as though nothing had changed. But for him, everything felt different. He wasn't here to impress anyone this time. He wasn't here to make himself the center of attention. He was simply looking for something he hadn't known he was missing, a kind of peace that he hadn't felt in a long time. When she noticed him, the waitress gave him a polite smile, the same smile she had given him when he had first walked into the cafe. But this time, instead of boasting about his wealth or trying to impress her with his success, he simply asked, "Would you mind if I listened to you play again?" She looked at him for a moment, her eyes soft but steady. There was no hint of surprise or judgment in her expression. She didn't know the transformation that had been taking place within him since their first encounter. All she knew was that he was simply another person who appreciated music. And for her, that was enough. "I'd be happy to," she replied, her voice warm and sincere. With a small nod, she made her way to the piano. He couldn't help but watch her, his gaze filled with a kind of quiet admiration. She wasn't here for the praise. She wasn't trying to show him how good she was. She was simply playing for the love of the music, and that was something he hadn't fully understood until now. She sat at the piano and began to play once more. It was the same melody from before, but it felt even more powerful this time, like it had grown into something more than just notes on a page. As her fingers danced across the keys, it was as though the entire room settled into a deep, collective breath. For a few minutes, everything else faded away. The traffic outside, the buzzing of phones, the noise of the world. There was only the music, and it wrapped itself around everyone in the room like a gentle embrace. As he listened, the businessman found himself caught in the music's pull. He had always been so busy, so driven, that he hadn't taken the time to appreciate the simple beauty of life. He hadn't taken the time to really listen to what others had to offer. And now, here he was sitting in a small cafe, listening to a woman who had nothing to prove, nothing to gain, simply pouring her heart into the piano. The music she played was full of emotion, joy, sadness, longing, all woven together in a way that only a true artist could manage. And for the first time in years, he found himself slowing down, letting go of his need to control everything. He let the music wash over him, not thinking about what came next, not thinking about the deal he had to close or the numbers that needed to be crunched. For the first time, he was simply present. The waitress finished her piece, her hands lingering on the keys for a moment before she gently pulled away. There was no applause, no rush to leave the piano. She looked over at him, her expression calm, waiting to see if he had anything to say, but for once he didn't need to speak. The silence between them felt comfortable, almost sacred. The businessman realized then that he didn't need to say anything to prove his respect for her. He didn't need to fill the space with words. The music had already spoken for both of them. He smiled and said, "Thank you." Her smile was small but knowing. "You're welcome." As he sat back, he felt a deep sense of peace. He had come to the cafe searching for something, though he wasn't sure what. But now he knew. What he had been looking for wasn't more success or more accomplishments. It wasn't recognition or validation. What he had been searching for was a return to simplicity, to joy, to authenticity. The businessman stood up to leave, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He had come to the cafe a man obsessed with proving himself to the world, but he was leaving as someone who had finally learned to listen, not just to the music, but to the deeper rhythms of life. As he walked out into the evening air, he knew he had a long way to go. But for the first time, he was ready to embrace the journey, to stop chasing things that didn't truly matter, and to start finding the things that did. And as for the waitress, she went back to her work, still as humble and composed as ever, unaware of the quiet change she had set in motion within him. She didn't need to know. After all, she wasn't in it for the recognition. She was simply doing what she loved, and in that she had already achieved everything she needed. The businessman's days began to change in ways he hadn't expected. Each morning, as he sipped his coffee in the quiet solitude of his office, his thoughts weren't consumed by the usual swirl of meetings, deadlines, and strategies. Instead, his mind often wandered back to the cafe, to the piano, to the simple, effortless way the waitress had shared her gift with the world. For weeks, he returned to that same cafe, not to make a deal or impress anyone, but simply to listen. He still couldn't put into words the full extent of the transformation that had taken place inside him, but he knew one thing for sure. Something in him had shifted permanently. He was no longer motivated solely by the drive for success or external validation. His perspective on what it meant to live a meaningful life had broadened, and now he sought something deeper: authenticity, creativity, and connection. He began to talk to people differently, his employees, clients, and even strangers. He no longer felt the need to impress or prove anything. He listened more intently when others spoke, and he paid attention to the things that really mattered. Not just the numbers or the outcomes, but the hearts and minds behind the work. His business meetings, once filled with tension and competition, now felt more like collaborative conversations. He found himself encouraging others to pursue what they were passionate about, to seek fulfillment beyond just financial gain. And it wasn't just in his professional life that things began to shift. At home, he started to enjoy the little things. He took more walks in the park, enjoyed meals without looking at his phone, and spent time with his family. Not out of obligation, but out of a genuine desire to be present. He even picked up an old guitar from his closet, a relic from his younger days, and began strumming simple chords, just for the joy of it. He didn't care if he wasn't the best guitarist or if his neighbors could hear him clumsily playing. What mattered was that he was doing something that brought him peace. But through it all, his thoughts often returned to the waitress, to her quiet strength, to her humility, to the way she had played the piano with such grace and passion, without seeking attention or approval. One afternoon, after finishing a meeting that had gone particularly well, he found himself walking down the familiar street toward the cafe again. This time, however, there was a different purpose. He didn't want to just sit and listen to her play. He wanted to thank her. He wanted to acknowledge the profound impact her music had had on his life, and let her know how much her quiet presence had changed him. As he entered the cafe, the usual calm atmosphere wrapped around him like a familiar embrace. The sound of coffee machines and the low hum of conversation filled the air, but it was the piano in the corner that caught his attention. There, sitting at the keys, was the waitress, once again lost in the music, as if the piano and the notes were as much a part of her as her own breath. He walked over to her, his heart beating a little faster than usual. She looked up from the keys, her expression neutral but her eyes warm and steady. "Hi," he said, his voice a little hesitant but sincere. "I don't know if you remember me, but I wanted to thank you for what you did." He paused, unsure how to express what he felt. "You didn't just play the piano that day. You changed something in me. I've been trying to figure out what it is, and I think I've finally realized. You showed me that there's more to life than just chasing success or recognition. There's beauty in the simple things, in the things that come from the heart." She studied him for a moment, then smiled softly, a small, almost imperceptible smile, but one that seemed to say she understood more than he could ever know. "I'm glad it helped," she replied, her voice as calm and genuine as ever. "I never played for anyone else. I just play because it feels right. But if it brought you something, that's all that matters." There was a quiet exchange between them as if no further words were necessary. He had come seeking answers, seeking acknowledgement, but he realized in that moment that the simple act of playing, of creating something beautiful without needing validation, was the answer. The businessman sat down at the table by the piano, watching her as she returned her focus to the keys. He wasn't in a hurry anymore. There was no rush. No need to be somewhere else, no checklist to tick off. All that mattered in that moment was the music, and then, as if on cue, she began to play again. This time the melody was different, gentler, more reflective, like the music had grown even more personal. It filled the cafe as it had before, but this time it felt even more intimate. He let the sound wash over him, letting go of everything else. Just being present with the music and with himself. As the notes drifted through the air, he thought about the way he had been living, the way he had once believed that success was something to be earned at all costs, how he had thought that happiness was something you could chase, achieve, and hold on to like a trophy. But now, after everything that had happened, he understood something far more important. Happiness wasn't something you could chase, it was something you found when you allowed yourself to live authentically, when you let go of the need to prove yourself and simply followed what resonated within you. When the last note finally faded away, the room remained still for a long moment. The businessman slowly stood up, feeling a sense of peace settle within him. He had come to the cafe seeking answers, but what he had found was something far more valuable. A new perspective on life, on success, and on what truly mattered. "Thank you," he said again, his voice filled with gratitude, though he knew words could never fully express what he felt. The waitress smiled at him, a smile that was kind but not expectant. She didn't need his thanks. She was simply doing what she loved, what came naturally to her, and that was enough. As he turned to leave, he felt lighter than he had in years. For the first time, he didn't feel the weight of expectation on his shoulders. He didn't feel the need to prove anything. The world didn't owe him anything, and he didn't owe it anything either. Life, he realized, was about moments like this, simple, quiet, and full of meaning. Moments that you don't chase or control, but simply experience. And as he stepped out into the cool evening air, the sound of the piano still lingering in his ears, he felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that he was finally living a life that was true to himself. No longer was he a man defined by his wealth or achievements. He was simply a person, someone who had learned the beauty of being present, the joy of creation, and the importance of living from the heart. And for the first time in his life, he felt truly free.